Bismillahirrahmanirrahim and Assalamu alaikum. April 1986, Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster, Russia. The Chernobyl disaster was the worst nuclear power plant accident in the history in terms of cost and casualties. Accident occurred because of the release of several tons of nuclear fuel and fission product due to the overheated water-cooled nuclear reactor. It is estimated that this accident spread 100 times more radioactivity than Hiroshima atomic attack. 45 people were killed at the spot and 161 people were evacuated from the site at different intervals. There are disputes over the exact figures given by different organizations. This accident discouraged regular use of nuclear power plant for the generation of electricity. Description of the site. According to the World Nuclear Association, Chernobyl nuclear power plant is located about 81 miles north of the city of the Kiev and about 12 miles south of the border with the Belarus. A man-made reservoir roughly 8.5 square miles in size was created to provide cooling water for the reactor. This reservoir was fed by the Pripyat River. The newly built city of Pripyat was the nearest town to the power plant at just 2 miles away and accommodated almost 50,000 people in 1986. A smaller, older town of Chernobyl was about 9 miles away and accommodated about 12,000 residents. The remainder of the region was primarily farm and woodlands. Layout of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. Located 9 miles away from the Chernobyl city, plant consisted of 4 reactors. It produced about 10% of the Ukraine's electricity requirement. Construction of the facility began in 1970s. Reactor 4 was completed in 1983. All 4 reactors were RBMK type. It is a Russian acronym which means high power channel reactor. RBMK uses water as the coolant and graphite to moderate the core's reactivity. To understand fully what had happened in the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, let us first understand its normal working. As the fission reaction occurs, uranium fuel becomes hot, releasing neutron as the fission product. A series of graphite blocks surrounds the pressure tube. These graphite blocks act as a moderators to slow down the neutrons released during the fission reaction, so the continuous chain reaction can be maintained. Water is pumped through the core in the pressure tube to remove the heat from the fuel. Steam is generated, which is then used to rotate the turbines, which is connected to the electricity generators. Water is then cooled in condenser and pumped back. Thus, this cyclic process continues. The accident. On April 25, 1986, routine maintenance was scheduled for the 4th reactor. The workers planned to use the downtime to test whether the reactor could still be cooled if the plant lost power. During the test, it was planned to turn power to half, that is about 500 megawatts. But the power fell too low. The workers continued the test, and in order to increase the power to 500 megawatts, some of the control rods were pulled out, although it was against the SOPs of the plant. The experiment also involved shutting down of the coolant pump, which caused reduced amount of coolant flow. This reduced amount of coolant flow causes the coolant to rapidly heat up and boil, and increasing the void coefficient of the reactor. As greater amount of steam was generated, the power level went up. To bring down the power, all the control rods were ordered to be inserted. Due to the increased temperature condition, those control rods were deformed and stuck halfway. because of which this chain reaction could not be stopped. The rods melted and the steam pressure caused an explosion, which blew a hole in the roof of the reactor. Radioactive debris of the fuel and the reactor component rained over the area. Immediate response. Firefighters' response at Chernobyl. Firefighters attempt to put out a series of blaze at the plant. They poured tons of water on this strange fire, but nothing seems capable of putting it out. They all were exposed to the lethal dosage of the radiation. Delay in evacuation. Despite the death of the two peoples in explosion, hospitalization of the workers and firefighter, the danger from the fallout, the evacuation of the area was not started until 36 hours after the disaster. Spread of the radiation. The meltdown had already spread radiations as far as Sweden, where the officials at the another nuclear plant began to ask about what had happened in Chernobyl, as their radioactive detectors were giving alarming signals of increased radioactivity. Announcement of the accident. After first denying accident, the Russians finally made a brief announcement on 28 April. The cleanup of the site, or the mission liquidating, was launched to clean up the nearby areas. Dumping of the sandbags. Helicopter dumped hundreds of tons of sandbags and boric acid to put down the fire in the reactor, but it didn't work. Then large amount of lead was also dumped. Evacuation of the adjacent area. Soviet Union eventually evacuated 3,35,000 people, establishing a 19-mile wide evacuation zone. Limiting the spread of radioactive particles. Military helicopters spread sticky material to reduce the spread of radioactive particles around the Chernobyl plants few days after the disaster. Liquidators were firemen who helped clean up the radioactive particle. They were in millions, and most of them don't know the hazards related to the radiations. Burying of the contamination. A large trench was dug in front of a house before burying the building and covering it with the earth. This method was applied to the entire village that were contaminated after the Chernobyl disaster. Victims of the disasters can be categorized into three main groups. Group 1 consists of the people involved in cleanup operation, that is military officers, plant operators, and firefighters. Group 2 involves the person evacuated from the evacuation zone. Group 3 involves the children of the people in Group 1 and Group 2, which were affected by the radiations. They have a genetical disorders. Victims of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disasters can be categorized into three main groups. Group 1 consists of people involved in cleanup operation, those military officers, plant operators, and firefighters which were involved in mission liquidating. Group 2 involves the person evacuated from the evacuation zone. Group 3 involves the children of the people in Group 1 and Group 2 because they were born with the genetical disorders due to the lethal dosage of the radiation their parent had. Reasons of the accident at nuclear power plant of the Chernobyl. Human error. Workers conducting the test were untrained and inexperienced. They lacked the knowledge of reactor physics and engineering. RBMK reactors were designed with the positive void fraction coefficient, which interfered in the immediate shutdown of the plant. There was insufficient communication between the safety officers and the operators in charge of the experiment. Automatic safety systems were powered off for the experiment. Initial denial about the occurrence of the accident increased the after effects of the disaster. Design flaws. In case of any emergency, control rods should be inserted within 1 to 2 seconds in the reactor core. But with the RBMK design, they took 17 seconds to be inserted in the nuclear fuel. A containment structure or shielding structure should enclose the nuclear reactor. So in case of any accident, spread of the radioactive particle could be prevented in the nearby vicinity. Nowadays, these containment structures are made of approximately 3 feet wide concrete sheet, which are strong. Now let's have a look on a small clip of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster. I have added only a small clip, but I would like you guys to watch the full documentary in your quarantine time.
Less than 2 miles from the city, the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power plant, where several thousand people go to work each day. Tonight, the 176 employees of Block 4 have been ordered to carry out a test on a self-fueling system of the reactor, something that could save energy. At 1:23 a.m., the security systems are deactivated and the experiment begins. A series of detonations go off in the core of the reactor. While Pripyat sleeps peacefully, the floor of the plant begins to tremble. The 1,200-ton cover of the reactor suddenly blasts into the air. An ultra-powerful stream of radioactive vapor releases uranium and graphite over hundreds of yards around the plant. From the gaping hole, a spray of fire charged with radioactive particles and fusion shoots more than 3,000 feet into the sky. The most serious nuclear accident in history has just taken place.
During the night, early in the morning, I got the call around 5 a.m. I was told there's been some accident at the Chernobyl nuclear plant.
The first firemen on the scene battle the fire without adequate protective gear. They pour tons of water on this strange fire, but nothing seems capable of putting it out. They're all exposed to lethal doses of radiation. 2 men die that night. 28 more will follow in the next few months. They are the first victims of Chernobyl. By early morning, the clouds are already being contaminated by the radioactive column rising 3,000 feet into the sky. Igor Kostin was a photographer with the news agency Novosti. When a friend and a helicopter pilot offers to fly him over Chernobyl that morning, all Kostin knows is that something happened at the plant during the night. He is the first journalist to witness the gaping hole.
When we flew over the block, I opened the window of the helicopter. I didn't realize then what a big mistake that was.
The thin, translucent smoke he sees rising from the ruins is in fact highly radioactive. Kostin is one of the few Chernobyl reporters on the scene in the early hours of the accident to have survived serious exposure to radiation. This is the first picture ever taken of the breach.
Once I returned to Kiev, I processed my pictures, and I noticed the negatives were black, and the colors very poor. I didn't know it yet, but the photos had been exposed to radioactivity.
At the core of the blown-up reactor, buried beneath nearly 50 feet of rubble, the graphite surrounding the nuclear fuel burns and melts the uranium. The radioactive fallout will be 100 times greater than the combined power of the 2 atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. At the Kremlin, 8 hours after the explosion, Gorbachev has little information on the situation.
Первая информация была такой.
The first information consisted of accident and fire. Not a word about an explosion. At first I was told there hadn't been an explosion. The consequences of such false information were particularly dramatic.
Meanwhile, clouds filled with radioactive particles are being blown north by the wind. Between the 26th and the 27th of April, they drift more than 600 miles across Russia, then over Belarus and the Baltics. On the 28th, they hit Sweden, where the rise of radioactivity is detected near one of their nuclear power plants.
To get more information about the Chernobyl nuclear power plant disaster, you can read it from the following sites.